Marie Moran is Associate Professor in Equality Studies at the University College Dublin School of Social Policy, Social Work, and Social Justice. She is Director of the UCD Equality Studies Centre. She served as Director of the Masters of Science program in Equality Studies from 2013 to 2017 and has taught on the program since 2007. She is also a core member of the teaching team on the Social Justice degree program since 2010. She teaches models on critical social theory, social movements, and egalitarian theory. Moran has an interdisciplinary background with a degree in English literature and psychology from Trinity College Dublin, where she graduated top of her class. No joke, she has a gold medal to prove it, and a Master of Science and PhD in Equality Studies, combining sociology, political theory, cultural studies, and political economy. She has published in a number of peer-reviewed journals, including the European Journal of Social Theory, the Sociological Review, the European Journal of Cultural Studies, the British Journal of Sociology, of Education, and Historical Materialism. Her first book, Identity and Capitalism, was published by Sage in 2015. And she is currently involved in a number of projects for publication, including 2 monographs, the forthcoming Elites and Left Politics with Verso, and Inequality in the 21st Century with Polity. An interest in equality and in dominant and residual cultural and political responses to inequalities animates and connects all her work. Marie was a Fulbright scholar in 2021 to 2022 at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she worked on a new framework for conceptualizing inequality and equality and a political history of the concept of elites. And we are delighted to have her join us once again. Marie, welcome.
Okay, well, thank you for the really lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be here. I'm only sorry I'm not there or here in person, given the wonderful time I spent at Madison a few years ago. So my talk today, as Adrian has said, is based on work carried out for my forthcoming book, Elites and Left Politics, which will be published by Verso later this year or early next year. So when Donald Trump took the White House for the second time, the New York Times immediately ran a piece from their chief White House correspondent with the online tagline, "Populist politics reject a world designed by elites." In it, Peter Baker argued that the damning election result could be explained by, quote, "a populist disenchantment with the nation's direction and resentment against elites that was deeper and more profound than any of the ruling elites had realized." In making this case, Baker used the very language Trump himself used in his ascension to power. Although radically opposed, it seemed Trump and the New York Times shared the view that the defeat of the Democrats and the re-election of Trump could both be explained by the failings of and resentment towards the so-called liberal elite. As happened after Trump's first election victory, social and political scientists rushed to explain how this could have happened again. Recently, Social Europe, a social democratic think tank, published this article by Swedish professor of political science Bo Rothstein, entitled "Why Trump Keeps Winning, the Truth No One Wants to Admit." Like many others concerned with why Trump has won, Rothstein rejects, on the one hand, economic hardship and inequality, and on the other, racism and immigration as primary or full explanations, arguing that both have long been a feature of US life. While these elements have undoubtedly contributed, Rothstein tells us, there is nonetheless a crucial question missing from the broader conversation, and it is this: what exactly has America's liberal, democratic, and culturally engaged elite done to provoke such profound anger, indeed outright hatred from large sections of the predominantly white working class and lower middle class driving them towards a politician like Donald Trump. The article then proceeds in fairly predictable ways. The main issue, we are told, is that liberal elites have prioritised identity politics over redistributive policies. Consider, he says, in a fair-minded tone, a young black applicant for university whose parents are both professors, compared with a young white applicant raised by a single mother working as a cleaner. The unfairness of giving preferential treatment to the black applicant here, it is suggested, is so patently obvious that he need not even spell it out. So although Rothstein initially defines identity politics in fairly neutral terms as targeted programs designed to benefit various minority groups, it isn't long before we end up on familiar reactionary terrain. Identity politics, he tells us, fosters division by pitting one group against another, undermining general trust and social solidarity. It revolves around raw group self-interest. It violates core liberal values of equal treatment and creates fertile ground for suspicions of corruption and unfairness. Is it any wonder then, he ends up asking, that the framing of, and again this is a quote, the entirely justified widespread protests against brutal police violence in the United States as Black Lives Matter rather than all lives matter equally may have inadvertently reinforced perceptions of ethnic division. Presumably this is the brave truth no one wants to admit. So, what's wrong with asking this question? Firstly, in the current discursive climate, it tends to direct answers towards a simplistic blaming of identity politics for the victory of Trump. There are, of course, many reasons to oppose narrow, corporatist versions of identity politics that take a blunt, colour-by-numbers approach, putting oppressed people in one box and advantaged people in another, while ignoring real material differences of social class and power between them. Nancy Fraser has referred to this as progressive neoliberalism. But there are other radical versions of identity politics associated with Black Lives Matter and other forms of activism that recognise that groups that are oppressed on one axis are often advantaged on another, giving them a stake in the very system that oppresses them. The problem here is not that the author of this article is critical of the forms of identity politics practiced by the Democratic Party, as indeed all leftists should be, but that he collapses all feminist and anti-racist forms of identity-based activism into this narrow neoliberal version of identity politics and throws them both out together. Who benefits from such an attack on identity politics? As the recent purging of all DEI programs in the US has shown, it's not the left, nor any of the disadvantaged groups they supposedly represent. But why would we be surprised by this? After all, and the second reason why asking this question in this way is a problem, is that this is also exactly the question Trump himself has asked. Key to his astonishing rise to power has been precisely the attack he has led on America's cultural, liberal and democratic elites, and crucially, how he has managed to connect this to a far-reaching assault on social justice politics and DEI, cast as wokeness generally. He has, of course, significant support in this. As Heritage Foundation President Kevin Roberts wrote in the foreword to Project 2025, the next Conservative president must possess the courage to relentlessly put the interests of the everyday American over the desires of the ruling elite. Or, as Republican Senator Tim Scott declared, President Trump represents the working class of America. He represents the victim who understands clearly that the only thing standing between the liberal elite and the everyday American is former President Donald Trump. And as Trump himself said, just after he was sworn in, for many years a radical and corrupt establishment has extracted power and wealth from our citizens, while the pillars of our society lay broken and seemingly in complete disrepair. On the left, we cannot begin here. We cannot accept as our starting point the successful framing of Trump, his allies, and indeed his right-wing counterparts across Europe and beyond. But this is not to let the so-called liberal elite off the hook. This is an effort to work out an appropriate left response, that does not throw out all forms of anti-racist, feminist organising in its rejection of the liberal or indeed neoliberal centre, and that does not offer a reactionary defence of a white working class. In short, this is an effort to work out an appropriate left response to the problem of elites. So if we cannot begin here with this line of questioning, where then should we begin? The first place we should begin is in the immediate aftermath of the global financial crisis, that is, the origins of our current anti-elitist moment. Although this is routinely identified as the start of a new era of populism, I want to bracket that for a moment and focus on it instead as the point in history when the idea of elites became very prominent in a new way on left and right. As we shall see, this focus generates a different perspective and produces a different and more fruitful set of questions. The years following the global financial crisis saw an explosion of attention to elites and the development of a fiery anti-elitist discourse in politics, new social movements and popular culture. Though not perfectly aligned, it was nonetheless apparent that in this period, left and right developed comparable and overlapping political imaginaries in relation to elites. On the left, calls for real democracy against the reign of unrepresentative elites animated the movements of the squares in 2011. Anger at economic elites criticised in the memorable Occupy slogan, which contrasted the 99% to the richest 1% globally. Bernie Sanders repeatedly emphasised the need to stand up to a corporate power elite, while Jeremy Corbyn challenged the Tory vision of a harsh society where wealth and power is hoovered up by a privileged elite. Pablo Iglesias of Podemos excoriated las élites económicas, or la casta, which he used to refer to the corrupt political and business elites who sold the country to the banks. Jean-Luc Mélenchon of La France Insoumise even launched a popular video game in which players literally shake down recognisable members of the financial elite until wads of money drop from their pockets. Meanwhile, a range of left newspapers, social media and podcasts routinely slammed unrepresentative, privileged and liberal elites across economics, politics and media. But this anti-elitist discourse also proliferated within right-wing politics and political cultures. In the immediate aftermath of the crisis, the Tea Party pursued a campaign against the misrule of intellectual, cultural and postal elites, including centrally Obama. Trump denounced decades of ruinous rule by a small handful of elites who were wrong on taxes, wrong on the size of government, on trade, on immigration, on foreign policy, and also financial elites who he accused of enriching politicians, leaving, quote, millions of our workers with nothing but poverty and heartache. Nigel Farage attacked the European political elite of parasites, living it up at the taxpayers' expense. Marine Le Pen called for freedom from arrogant elites for whom money is king. The German Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, set out its opposition to a small and powerful elite, focused on their own power-based status and material well-being. And right-wing social media and websites became consumed with the threat of globalist elites, a supposed international cabal of secretive bankers and politicians seeking world domination. Although these anti-elitist discourses burst onto the scene from 2010, they did not come from nowhere. Rather, as we shall explore, they have a long, complex history in the political imaginaries, scholarship, and forms of activism associated with left and right. Nonetheless, we can trace to these post-crisis years the emergence of an overlapping anti-elitist critique on left and right, which, though shifting somewhat now, nonetheless persists today. Financial, liberal, cultural, political, and privileged elites are routinely maligned by both left and right. Even when anchored in quite different policy and political agendas, it's often hard to distinguish the anti-elitist sentiment that animates them. The consequences of this overlap have been and continue to be significant. In this post-crisis context where old left and right political allegiances have lost ground, and new populist, anti-establishment or anti-system formations claiming to override them captured support from across the political spectrum, there has been a great deal at stake in the overlap of left and right political imaginaries around elites. Take, for example, the Gilets jaunes in France, for whom hostility to elites seemed to underpin both a radical critique of inequality and a racist conspiracy theory of lost entitlement. Or voters in the US, who persuaded that their economic and cultural dispossession could be explained by the illegitimacy of cultural, financial, and liberal elites, jumped from Trump to Sanders and back again. Or elements of the British electorate, who, disillusioned amongst other things with a democratic deficit in the EU, were persuaded to give power to an even smaller British elite. Across these examples, we see evidence of an alignment of messaging across and slippage between distinct left and right positions in virtue of their shared anti-elitism. But in the absence of any concerted effort to clearly differentiate a properly left anti-elitism, such slippage remains a real practical danger today. For one thing, such overlap can potentially channel concerns about the illegitimate hoarding of wealth and power at the top into support for a range of policies and actions that are racist, nativist, or otherwise anti-egalitarian in character. Indeed, a study of attitudes in the 2016 US presidential election found that respondents who scored most highly in terms of the dimension of anti-elitism are, quote, far more likely to endorse conspiracy theories of all types than not, are less trusting of people in general, and also more likely to be nativists and hold fundamentalist beliefs. And such unchecked slippages render the left even more vulnerable to mainstream political and media efforts to insist upon a horseshoe theory of left and right convergence, thereby distorting the distinctiveness of a left response to extremes of inequality and undermining any radical emancipatory intent by positioning it as equally on the lunatic fringe. But lurking behind these political dangers, there is a curious analytical puzzle, and resolving this is crucial to articulating a distinctive left anti-elitism. And it is this: how can it be that politicians and activists of left and right, upholding very different political values and ambitions, share an opposition to elites? There seems to be a peculiar lack of critical attention to this question. Where it is noticed, one of three answers are preferred. Firstly, it may be supposed, and is sometimes argued, that left and right are opposed to different elite groups, with the left focusing on economic elites and the right on cultural elites. But even our cursory overview of the elites singled out for approbation on left and right shows much greater overlap than difference here. Cultural, political, and economic elites targeted on both left and right. For now, the greater puzzle is that left and right should share an anti-elitist sentiment at all. Indeed, if we characterise the distinction between left and right in terms of a moral and practical orientation towards equality versus inequality, respectively, then the right-wing exhibition of an anti-elitist sentiment, ostensibly opposed to concentrations of power and wealth in the hands of a privileged few, is disconcerting, if not perplexing. But even if we are not persuaded that this is the key difference between left and right, we might still be surprised that the right, which is traditionally associated with the defence of hierarchical social and economic orders, should adopt an anti-elitist attitude. This much at least has been remarked upon by commentators who have noted the oddity of Donald Trump, an elite in any commonsensical use of the term, running, now twice, on an explicitly anti-elitist platform. This observation gives rise to the second common answer to the question. Indeed, for many, the only plausible answer to the puzzle of right-wing anti-elitism is that it is a sham anti-elitism, a conjurer's trick designed to distract attention from their own elite status. Though this is immediately appealing, even obvious as an answer, it is also too easy. How do visibly privileged, powerful, and wealthy actors on the right pull off such a coup? Are their supporters simply hoodwinked, or is there something else happening? What explains the enormously mobilizing force of anti-elitist sentiment on the right? Dismissing such anti-elitist sentiment on the grounds that it is not really anti-elitism misses a trick. After all, many people are persuaded to support virulently right-wing anti-egalitarian agendas on precisely anti-elitist grounds. Anti-elitist sentiment on the right ought to be taken seriously by the left, not as an obvious sham or duplicity, but as a powerful mobilizing force to be reckoned with. But the third and main answer given to this question is that it is all explained by populism. Indeed, the peculiar lack of political and scholarly attention to these overlapping elitisms derives, I believe, from the widely held assumption that contemporary expressions of anti-elitism on left and right are fully explained, and indeed only relevant for their role in the resurgence of populism. The discourse of anti-elitism, we the people versus elites, is, the argument goes, a mainstay of populist rhetoric, and so we might expect such anti-elitist sentiment to emerge as part of the recent renewal of populism. The invective against elites in the oratory of Sanders and Trump occupying the Tea Party, Podemos and the National Front can be explained, therefore, by understanding all these formations as populist in the first instance. And accordingly, their shared emphasis on elites should present no special puzzle. In effect, however, arguments that rely on populism to explain a shared anti-elitism tend to do one of two things. One, they use populism to override the left-right distinction, which then obscures the difference we're trying to explain. Or two, they import the left-right distinction into the populist frame, which nonetheless leaves us with the question of how it is that political positions supporting and challenging inequality can be equally opposed to the privilege and power of elites. On these grounds, I think we should make an intervention into these debates around populism to focus directly on the expressions of anti-elitism that are shared across contrasting political positions of left and right. Contemporary discourses of anti-elitism require careful consideration on their own terms. What, if anything, distinguishes the discourse of anti-elitism as it manifests on left and right? What work is the concept of an elite doing in the political imaginaries of left and right? And ultimately, should the left continue to use the concept of an elite and engage in a politics of anti-elitism? And if so, how? In order to address these questions, in order to properly explain the convergence of left and right anti-elitisms, to fully understand the political consequences of this, and ultimately to develop an anti-elitism fit for left politics, we must first break free from the assumption that anti-elitist politics are entirely contained or explained by populism. Although the populist context is of key importance, populism cannot explain it all. And as I say in the book, this is not another book about populism. As we've already said, mobilizing the juggernaut of populism to explain anti-elitism on left and right obscures more than it explains. But in addition, where populism is cast as an unthinking, dangerous reaction to more worthy mainstream politics, understanding anti-elitism as simply populism serves to place objections to elite power and privilege outside the remit of respectable, viable politics. Third reason, as we will see, is that anti-elitist sentiment and politics can and do exist independently of populist formations. Anti-elitist claims often call up, but do not require, a vision of the people against which the elite are critiqued. Failure to see this leads many historians to misrecognize socialist, nationalist, or fascist politics that rely on anti-elitist sentiment as populist. This has serious consequences not only for how we understand or how seriously we take these political forms, but for our very capacity to evaluate and understand different varieties of anti-elitism. Fourthly, populism tends to focus attention on the construction of a people. But this misses the extent to which the concept of an elite, and not just a people, does profound ideological work in populism and beyond. And finally, the political context has changed. What we might call the high populist moment, characterised by populist mobilisations in the streets and in the squares, has passed and has largely been absorbed into parliamentary politics with greater electoral traction on the right. But whether you prefer to characterise this current moment as the long populist moment, as Mouffe does, and I think as Anderson did recently, or post-populism, as Gerbaudo suggests, this is still a period of interregnum in which the issues raised by the near collapse and then rehabilitation of neoliberalism and the top-down and bottom-up populist responses to this have not yet been resolved. And central to this is the competing anti-elitisms and profound ideological work still being done by the concept of an elite. In this period, the questions I raised about the value of the idea of elites and the practices of anti-elitism on left and right have not yet been answered. Even after this high point of anti-elitist activity, the political imagination remains suffused by questions of illegitimate elites. On the right, leaders such as Babis, Blocher, Bolsonaro, Duterte, Erdogan, Modi, Netanyahu, Putin, Salvini, Strachey and Wilders have all prominently employed anti-elitist rhetoric, either in government or opposition, well into the 2020s. This is the case even as their anti-elitism has been increasingly accompanied by more overt attacks on migrants, Muslim and Jewish communities, welfare recipients, women, and LGBTQ people. But on the left, anti-elitist discourse has waned and weakened. The anti-elitist campaigns of immediate post-crisis years have been displaced by campaigns like Black Lives Matter, campaigns for climate justice, and so on. Where they have been incorporated into electoral politics, as happened with Podemos, Syriza, Corbyn's Labour and Sanders' Social Democrats, these have typically lost at the ballot box. The COVID pandemic saw a new spike in anti-elitist discourse directed against medical experts, the pharmaceutical industry, the media and national governments intent on locking down their citizens. But it seems that any liminal emancipatory anti-elitist themes have been muddled, distorted, and then finally fully captured by reactionary conspiratorial perspectives. As Ega and Springer point out, on the political right, the anti-elite pattern has, in many cases, become indissoluble from their overall war of position. But it is primarily the political left that does not know what to do with the wide spectrum of anti-elitist articulations at this point. Now seems like a good time to take stock, to examine the work done by the idea of elites and discourses of anti-elitism, and to focus on the value of anti-elitism for the left. What started as an unpacking of a particular historical moment and its contradictions has developed into a much deeper unpicking of the logic of anti-elitism and its value to the left, historically and today. Answering these questions is then at the heart of the book, and it involves going back much further than the global financial crisis. Back over 100 years to trace the evolving idea of an elite and its changing meanings and uses over time. It also involves distinguishing different varieties of anti-elitism. I shall elaborate these as emancipatory, reactionary, and liberal anti-elitism. It involves tracing these varieties of anti-elitism historically in terms of what they have achieved and what they have lost for the left. And it means using this framework to answer some key anti-elitist dilemmas for the left in the current moment. It also involves rethinking the concept of an elite so it is fit for purpose for left politics in the 21st century. In the second half of this talk, I'm going to focus mainly on these first three tasks. I have prepared slides on the final two, but I think I'll have to leave them for another day or until you read the book. Anyway, let's see. So let's start by looking much more closely at the concept of an elite, both as it exists in the popular and political imagination and in scholarly and academic theorizations to which it is inevitably related. What shows up here is the taken for granted nature of the concept of an elite. Indeed, the lack of critical attention to the concept of an elite stands in stark contrast to the treatment of the notion of a people, which has been subject to sustained critical analysis and deconstruction. Across the social sciences, but most especially within political science, economic, cultural, and political elites are simply assumed to exist as measurable, identifiable groups out there. In this respect, political science reproduces and legitimizes the populist imagination underpinning the populist politics they study. But even in the most usefully critical literature on populism, there is a tendency nonetheless to use the term elites rather loosely, to refer to powerful groups illegitimately holding and exercising power, even as they recognise elsewhere that such a formulation is absolutely central to the populist mindset they dissect. With the emphasis on denaturalising the concept of a people, the concept of an elite is left to flit unhappily between a discursive trump and a real group. This, I suggest, is because while the notion of a people to whom the powerful can appeal and in whose interests they can claim to act is readily recognisable as a potent political construction, the same is not true of the concept of an elite. Indeed, there seems to be a widespread acceptance within the social sciences of the very existence of elites as self-evident groups rather than political productions, while the people rarely exist outside of scare quotes, the elites almost always do. But I want to suggest there are no such prima facie elite groups available for analysis. Instead, it is always a political decision to view certain groups in these terms. Where Raymond Williams famously wrote, "There are in fact no masses, only ways of seeing people as masses," we may add, there are no elites, but only ways of seeing people as elites. What does it mean to see people as elites? These days, it seems, almost any supposedly privileged or powerful group can be described as an elite, not just political leaders and corporate chiefs, but also intellectuals, experts, bureaucrats, media figures, athletes, and liberal commentators. How is it that all these disparate groups can be construed as elites? What is it about the meaning of the word that allows such capacious application? And what, in turn, does describing these groups as elite do to our understanding of them? To answer this question, it's useful to consider elite a keyword in the sense intended by Raymond Williams. That is to say, a commonplace word straddling specialist and everyday vocabulary whose problems of meaning are inextricably bound up with the problems it is used to discuss. Typically, there's no general puzzlement over the meaning of a keyword. Rather, it seems self-evident, obvious, confirmed by a general sense that everyone knows what it means. But such easy familiarity can conceal a history and complexity of meanings. Changes which are marked by a nominal continuity, so that the words which seem to have been there for centuries, with continuous general meanings, have come in fact to express radically different or radically variable, yet sometimes hardly noticed meanings and implications of meaning. This is demonstrably the case with the word elite. Elite is a commonplace and taken for granted word in both politics and social theory, but typically little call for clarification of its meanings where it is used. Despite or because of this, it is used to refer to an astonishingly wide variety of individuals and groups, many of whom have little in common. Furthermore, it has also mobilized a variety of changing, overlapping, and conflicting meanings and evaluations, both explanatory and moral, in referring to these groups. This, as we shall see, is the source of its ideological power. Deriving from the classical Latin eligere, to choose, the word elite was originally used interchangeably with the elect, with the dual sense of elected to office and the select, as in the chosen ones. By the early 19th century, the term elite had come to express mainly social distinction by rank, and then consolidated around the notion of superiority to convey the idea of best in kind or cream of the crop. The term first entered social theory as a deliberate alternative to socialist and Marxist class analysis, as a means of explaining and justifying minority rule, something almost universally missed in the contemporary left embrace of the category of elites. We find in the work of the early elite scholars, Mosca and Pareto, a clear and unabashed expression of the conservative view that inequality is natural and desirable. It is natural because the division of society into elites and masses reflects the natural distribution of talent, such that a minority are born to excel in their respective fields, while the majority remain exceptional, if not deficient. It is desirable because societies require these exceptional people as leaders, who are equal to the task of running an economy and a polity, and deserving of any privileges this confers. Overall then, from the 19th to the early 20th century, elite was used as a way of justifying inequality because it combined the idea of advantage with the idea of superiority. There's no easy way for those opposed to inequalities of wealth, status, and power to use the term elite, since at this point, the term elite primarily signified deserved advantage. To posit the existence of an elite in this period was therefore also to claim that those at the top of the power, wealth, and status hierarchies deserved to be there. However, as the 20th century progressed, the evaluative sense of elite began to change from a laudatory concept signifying deserved advantage to a pejorative concept signifying undeserved advantage. How this happened was directly related to the post-war socio-political context in which newly minted egalitarian discourses and aspirations, which found expression in the UN Declaration of Human Rights and various strengthened welfare initiatives, displaced and undermined older, explicitly pro-elite perspectives. This corresponded with a period of liberal hegemony in the West, characterized by the belief that liberalism had vanquished the dual threats of communism and fascism and ushered in a new era with democratic pluralism and meritocratic equality of opportunity. In this context, the very idea previously captured by an elite, that the naturally superior were entitled to extensive privilege, just wouldn't do. The term was also in this period reimagined by scholars working in a democratic socialist or anti-capitalist tradition, notably C. Wright Mills, and then Bourdieusian scholars, who also used the term in a pejorative sense to refer to the unduly powerful and privileged. But across all these uses, pejorative and laudatory, some features of the term remained constant. I'll refer to this as the differentia specifica of an elite. Excuse me. The differentia specifica is those features that make the concept what it is and distinguish it from cognate others. Identification of the differentia specifica provides important referential gravity. It allows us to see that where the word elite is used without mobilizing these features, this can only be in the manner of Humpty Dumpty, that is, without regard for the socially shared meanings that give it its purchase. In case you don't know, Humpty Dumpty apparently said in a scornful tone, "When I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." Overall, it is this core set of meanings that gives the term its analytical and its ideological power. That is, a small set of superior agents holding disproportionate power and privileges in specific domains, the legitimacy of which is in question. And this is what gives it its analytical and its ideological power. In what follows, I'm going to focus just on its ideological power. I don't have time to look at its analytical power as an alternative to the Marxist notion of a ruling class. So, it is this meaning that invests the term with its extraordinary ideological power. With the pejorative sense dominant, the term now functions normatively to cast doubt on an elite group's claim to superiority and thus to challenge the power and privileges they enjoy. Whosoever is characterized as an elite, whether a bureaucrat, financier, politician, academic, or celebrity, the effect is to raise questions about the legitimacy of their power and or privilege. It is thus in its pejorative sense that the concept of an elite is valuable to actors on both left and right, since it allows each to characterize the groups they oppose as neither truly superior nor deserving of the privileges they hold. It is also therefore the pejorative sense of an elite that animates and propels a politics of anti-elitism, in which accusations of illegitimate, undeserved, undemocratic power and privilege are the primary driving and mobilizing force. The consolidation of the pejorative sense of the word elite sheds light on the peculiar curiosity of right-wing as opposed to mainstream or left-wing actors adopting anti-elitist positions. After all, it is very difficult to express a pro-elite position when the term itself means undeserved advantage. But crucially, there is more than a discursive shift at stake here. The adoption of anti-elitist positions across the political spectrum is not just due to the changing meanings of the word, but only makes sense in terms of deeper philosophical, moral, and political positions associated with left, right, and centre. For despite what the mainstream media and some political science scholarship tells us about a horseshoe convergence of left and right populist extremes in a shared anti-elitism, left and right are not anti-elitist in the same way. And how they differ are, I argue, is in virtue of the animating mindsets which provide their anti-elitism with content. After all, if anti-elitist politics proceed, by definition, by challenging the undeservedly privileged, then we ought to be clear about what a politics of privilege looks like. So the concept of privilege has its etymological roots in the Latin concept of a private law that exempts special individuals from the laws that apply to others. This has persisted in the legal contrasting of universal rights as to privileges as special rights belonging to the individual or class and not the mass. And a more general sense of privilege has evolved from these legal uses to refer to rights, advantages, and immunities beyond the norm, captured in this definition from the Oxford English Dictionary. They date this to the 1300s, and it's interesting to see that it still persists today. The idea of privilege has, however, recently undergone a shift, largely due to its recentering within progressive scholarship and discourse, where it has been theorized anew to refer more specifically to unearned assets conferred systematically. In many analyses today, it's this newer sense of privilege that is taken as the axiomatic point of departure. But it's important to recognize when we're looking at the history of anti-elitist politics that it is this broader sense of advantages beyond the norm that has been at work. There's something about the very idea of privilege that, though it invokes notions of inequality, nonetheless runs up against this concept. The effect of this is that the logic and tendencies of a politics of privilege are somewhat at odds with the politics of equality and inequality that characterizes left and right. At the same time, there are certain features of the concept that enable it to be exploited towards different ends by forces on left and right. Firstly, the idea of privilege, particularly evident in the notion of being privileged, puts the focus on the characteristics, benefits, and positions of the privileged groups themselves. Individuals and groups are the bearers of privilege, and they hold this of their own accord in their own beings. Privilege is often understood to be inscribed in people's bodies, their skin, their caste, their gender. They are privileged persons. This atomism runs up against the very notion of equality, which instead is intrinsically relational and focuses on the comparative fortunes of two groups. Consequently, where the focus is on inequality, what matters morally is whether it is right for some group or individual to have more than or to be treated better than others. In contrast, what matters morally from the point of view of privilege is whether its bearers deserve it. Secondly, because the notion of privilege remains primarily possessive rather than relational, it can obscure any sense in which someone is privileged because of a direct transfer of resources, power, or status from one group to another. Of course, this is what the new progressive accounts of privilege attempt to remediate by stressing unearned assets conferred systematically. Nonetheless, the very idea of privilege is such that, in the absence of such interventions, it will tend to deflect attention from systematic causes. Third feature of the concept is that it leaves open the question of whether those advantages and immunities referred to as privileges are in fact universal rights, due to all but denied to many, or scarce special advantages or luxuries that by definition can only accrue to a few. This indicates for me not a flaw in the concept, as some suppose, but rather its ideological flexibility and utility. Related to this, there is uncertainty over whether being privileged is a normal or exceptional state of affairs, and whether, therefore, it is morally objectionable or something to aspire to. This is perfectly illuminated by the everyday use of the language of privilege. The use of privilege to mean a rare and deeply valued gift or opportunity, as in the phrases, I'm privileged to be here tonight, I was privileged to know, etc., emphasizes that the state of being privileged, being blessed, is an exceptional one for which we should be grateful. Not only does this suggest that lacking these advantages is the typical or normal status, it further implies that such privilege is not morally objectionable, but just a matter of good luck. In contrast, the curious language of underprivilege suggests that having advantages is the normal and desirable status, while nonetheless maintaining the sense that this is a mainly accidental feature of life. Groups labelled underprivileged are imagined, through no fault of their own, to be lacking the resources and opportunities that would enable them to lead a good or privileged life. As Williams notes in his entry for underprivileged in keywords, the term captures almost exactly that combination of sympathy for the victims of a social order with the conviction or unnoticed assumption that such an order will or must continue to exist. Finally, the idea that privilege is conferred in virtue of birthright, social structure, or simply good luck means that it is a curiously passive concept. The bearers of privilege do not deliberately, consciously, or actively acquire it, and may not even be aware that they hold it. In this respect, too, the idea of privilege has an ideological function insofar as it implies an absence of knowledge and intent which may or may not be true in any given circumstance, and that can be challenged or reinforced in the politics of privilege that ensue. Overall, the concept of privilege invites uncertainty over whether any given set of advantages beyond the norm are justified or not, and in virtue of this, directs our attention away from questions of inequality to questions of desert. If one takes issue with privilege, the imagined problem is not so much the fact that one group has greater advantages or disadvantages or immunities than another, which is a straightforward inequality, but that this disparity is deemed unjustified and the privileged group undeserving of the rewards and protections accruing to them. It is this logic of a politics of privilege that allows conservative actors to challenge undeserved or unearned privilege, while nonetheless having no moral objection to the fact of privilege or inequality at all. So I'm going to finish with this table. There's 3 different parts on different varieties of anti-elitism, and leave the question of different histories of anti-elitism and the dilemmas maybe for the discussion. So I have about 10 minutes left. We're now in a position to set out 3 varieties of anti-elitism that I characterise as emancipatory, liberal, and reactionary anti-elitism. Each form of anti-elitism is presented as an ideal type and named after the political philosophy that animates it. However, as these philosophies often appear in less formal, more practical ways, I refer to them as animating spirits or mindsets. While each variety of anti-elitism is animated by a rejection of undeserved privilege, how this is understood and defined differs in accordance with the animating mindset. The animating mindset also determines who should be understood as the bearers of such undeserved privilege, in other words, who the elites are. Neither saturating nor exhausting the political space, each variety of anti-elitism instead operates as a distinctive current or impulse within left, right, or mainstream politics. Further, the expression of each variety of anti-elitism through different host politics on left, right, and in the mainstream gives rise to different emphases and tendencies in the practical anti-elitist politics that pertain. This conceptual sorting is important as it allows us to trace and distinguish a range of competing and incompatible normative evaluations and political positions which, on the face of it, are united in their shared opposition to elites, yet which in practice serve radically different political goals. I'll take each in turn. Emancipatory anti-elitism is a form of anti-elitist critique and political practice that is animated by an emancipatory spirit concerned with freedom from oppression and liberation for a wide range of groups. Like other varieties of anti-elitism, it is animated by a general critique of privilege. What makes it emancipatory, however, is its concern not just with the unjust allocation of privilege, but with its very existence. Thus, rather than seek to reallocate privilege so that it is more fairly or evenly distributed between groups, or to rehabilitate privilege so that it reflects only justified forms of merit or efficiency, the aspiration of emancipatory anti-elitism is to eradicate it completely. Emancipatory anti-elitism is associated with left-wing politics and efforts to achieve a radically more equal social order. Historically, it has emerged through forms of left populism, social democracy, and social justice politics. The elites opposed by emancipatory anti-elitism are then those individuals at the top of various social hierarchies who stand over and benefit from different forms of social oppression while blocking the flourishing or even causing the suffering of the oppressed. They are the millionaires and billionaires of the world who enjoy lives of unlimited freedom and possibility, while the lives of millions are reduced to drudgery in their service. They are the corporate rich, the financiers and speculators who act as social vampires, sucking up wealth while exploiting and degrading workers and the environment. They are political leaders who acquire and wield power in a radically undemocratic fashion. They are the upper middle class professionals, managers and experts who, on the back of their attendance at elite schools and universities and their operation of mechanisms of social closure, acquire high personal status and discipline the masses. They are also the occupiers of privileged identity categories, the white, able-bodied middle-class men who accrue enormous advantages and immunities simply in virtue of the group they belong to. Two caveats here. Firstly, none of this is to say that anytime anyone on the left engages in anti-elitism, it is automatically emancipatory. After all, this slipperiness is precisely at the heart of the problem with which we are grappling. And it is possible, and we've seen it, that left actors can engage in liberal and reactionary anti-elitism too. Secondly, there are certain tensions within emancipatory anti-elitism as an orientation on the left specifically that arise from the politics of privilege that animate it. While it is possible to push a progressive orientation to privilege to its ultimate conclusion, i.e. the total eradication of privilege, this nonetheless runs up against the more general logic of a politics of privilege, which moves us away from questions of equality to questions of desert. This raises the question of the limits of an emancipatory anti-elitism, both on its own terms and insofar as it can achieve the aims of left politics. Reactionary anti-elitism, then, is a form of anti-elitist politics and criticism that is informed by a reactionary spirit, concerned to restore privileges to previously powerful groups. Like all varieties of anti-elitism, it is motivated by a critique of privilege that appears progressive. However, on closer inspection, we see that the reactionary spirit is not opposed to privilege and hierarchy at all, just with its allocation to undeserving groups. Thus, reactionary anti-elitists share a worldview with traditional conservatives who defend their privileges on patriarchal, capitalist and racist grounds. What differentiates them is that while conservatives openly defend traditional elites, reactionary anti-elitists attack those newly elite groups whose privilege is deemed unjustifiable within the hierarchical social order they support. These unduly privileged groups are usually imagined to be coddled liberals, media figures, government officials and experts, as well as increasingly woke academics and social justice actors. These groups are deemed to be enjoying a range of special advantages, protections and immunities that they do not deserve. In addition, these elites are charged with providing special treatment for undeserving minorities, for women, migrants, transgender people, welfare recipients, and even snowflake students. In all of this, there is a true elite, the truly deserving who have lost their privileges and entitlements, though given the contemporary meaning of the term, they cannot refer to themselves as such. Although amusingly, this has been too much for Donald Trump on various occasions when he has castigated the liberal elite and then said, no, I'm the real elite. In the American context, these truly deserving and entitled are the white working class, or more accurately, the white wealth producers. This can include the productive working class, but never the welfare class, but also capitalists and industrialists who are deemed productive. Financial elites are, however, deemed unproductive and parasitic on the wealth of others, and those are not part of the truly deserving, but one of the undeservedly privileged groups attacked within reactionary anti-elitism. Although purely associated with the right, this form of anti-elitism is therefore reactionary in character, precisely because it seeks to secure what it views as natural or traditional privilege against emancipatory efforts to eradicate it, as well as against more mainstream efforts to reduce or, quote, diversify it. And this is how it is that reactionary anti-elitism can be practiced by actors who understand themselves to be on the left. Reactionary anti-elitism also varies in focus as it emerges through different host politics, Channeled through right-wing populism, it tends to emphasize the special interests and special privileges of parasitic elites. However, where it is forged in the crucible of newer alt-right or incel politics, the tendency is instead to mobilize ideas of lost masculine entitlement, to rail against the illegitimate sexual privileges accruing to conventionally attractive white heterosexual men and women. In both cases, there is no effort to challenge any economic, racial, or sexual inequalities in themselves. Instead, the emphasis is on the exclusion of the forgotten ones from the spoils of inequality and the return of privilege away from undeserving elites to its righteous inheritors. Finally, and I'll finish on this one, liberal anti-elitism. This is a form of anti-elitist critique in politics that exhibits a liberal spirit, concerned with the institution of fair procedures, personal freedoms, and equal opportunities that enable and justify individual success. Liberals, it is famously said, are not concerned with any effort to eradicate inequality, but simply with the effort to make inequality fair. Within this context, liberal anti-elitism can be distilled to the view that it is wrong for certain groups, i.e. elites, to deploy their wealth or power to circumvent the fair rules and procedures of liberal institutions, including education systems and markets, to their own advantage. They do not mind that some groups come out on top, but only that how they do so should be fair. The elites targeted are thus wealthy members of old boys networks and corrupt political figures who have used their advantages, connections, and family name to game the system and come out on top. Against such elite figures, liberal anti-elitists champion those successful leaders and professionals who have made it to the top on their own. But since liberal anti-elitism views success earned through hard work and talent as fair, as a consequence, it prefers not to call it privilege at all, nor those who hold it elites. Of the three varieties of anti-elitism, liberal anti-elitism is the odd sister. The spontaneous distrust of privilege, which seems to animate reactionary and emancipatory variants, is absent, replaced by an institutionalized respect for expertise, merit, and the right kinds of privilege. We may conjecture that without a meaning change in the word elite, liberals would not be inclined to view themselves anti-elitist at all. Liberal anti-elitism characterizes mainstream politics. Despite its presentation as such, this is not a neutral space, an ideologically empty centre positioned between the extremes of left and right, but rather an intensely ideological space where left and right values jostle for hegemony. Where a progressive attitude to privilege wins out, this pulls liberal anti-elitism leftward, manifesting in social democratic efforts to level the playing field for the competition for unequal rewards presented by equal opportunity. Since this political practice is not concerned with the eradication of privilege, it cannot be considered an emancipatory form of anti-elitism. Nonetheless, it should be recognised as a more equalising force, concerned with putting in place the social conditions that would allow for fairer competition for advantage. In philosophical terms, this is expressed as liberal egalitarianism. In political terms, it is supported by redistributive welfare states that focus on raising minimum standards for all groups and equalising access to education. Where or when the conservative orientation to privilege is stronger, it pulls liberal anti-elitism rightward. This manifests neither as reactionary anti-elitism nor as a forthright expression of simple elitism, but instead as an unbridled support for meritocracy as itself a form of anti-elitism. This views social mobility entirely as an effect of effort plus talent within an individualist conception of society as a zero-sum game where everyone can succeed if they try hard enough. What you have now in the US is precisely this form of unbridled meritocracy, where any supports for disadvantaged groups have been taken away, construed instead as unfair treatment for unduly privileged groups that prevents recognition of supposedly true merit. So I had a few more slides to show you. This is an early form of emancipatory anti-elitism, the American populists. This is Richard Nixon, who developed a very powerful form of reactionary anti-elitism, and then Tony Blair, a very powerful form of meritocratic or liberal anti-elitism. But I'm going to stop there and thank you for listening to this very long talk, and I look forward to your questions.
So first things first, I will read out the first question, which is a rather pointed and straightforward one, but I think it is very much in keeping with what you're trying to do here, Marie, which is from Lynn Jones, who writes, how does elite, as you have very deftly defined or complicated for us here, differ from the concept of class? And what are you trying to do? How are you using both, or how are you thinking about both concepts?
Thank you, Lynn. Well, I think, part of what I didn't get to talk about was precisely how the concept of an elite has been used in a way that differs very radically from the concept of social class. So when the concept of an elite was introduced into social theory 100 years ago, it was introduced as a deliberate alternative to the idea of a ruling class. And it was deliberately introduced in this way because it was meant to suggest that people who were in positions of power economically and politically were there because of their superior qualities. They were there because they deserved to be there. They were there because they were fit to run politics, society, and an economy. That was supposed to challenge the idea of a ruling class who had come to power basically on the back of a power grab, who'd come to power precisely in virtue of their exploitative relationship to the working class. So the concept of an elite from the very start was introduced as an ideological way of challenging socialist or Marxist or class ideas, which saw social class divisions as intrinsically unfair, as based on relations of exploitation, rather than a reflection of who was truly superior and who was, deficient or inferior in society. So from that point, I think that basic point has often been obscured or forgotten about in more shallow histories of an elite. And as I tried to trace in the book, the term elite has come to be used to simply refer to groups that are undeservedly privileged. That means the left can use it as much as the right. But it does obscure that kind of foundational distinction. So I would see the elite, I think there are grounds for the left to develop the concept in a way that takes it away from its reactionary uses and align it with class. I think it can be developed in a way that it describes concentrations of power rather than concentrations of wealth, or concentrations of power that are rooted in wealth, which is also foundational to the idea of class. So part of what I did, and again, part of the book that I couldn't talk about, was think about how we can align those concepts. But I see them as very, very different. And I think the left has to be very, very careful about how it uses the concept of an elite so it doesn't fall into these reactionary traps.
No, it's a simple question. The liberal elite, what are the conditions on the ground that stirs them rightwards or leftwards? The liberal elites, and what are the sort of conditions on the ground that would stir them to go right and that would stir them to go left?
So, okay, let me just think so I think I suppose what I am concerned about, where I kind of started off, was this a critique of liberal. I mean, don't get me wrong. I how the Democratic Party, how the centre, how professionals and financiers and all the rest of it have sort of sewn up political and social systems to their advantage. Brought down the global economy, have precipitated and benefited from extremes of inequality. I'm no fan of any of that. I'm critical of that. But what I'm trying to look at is how different actors on left and right can develop an appropriate critique of liberal elites that doesn't end up in that very reactionary space that involves throwing out all social justice values, all feminist and racist organizing, and defending a white working class. So I guess I'm not particularly looking at what are the conditions that allow a liberal elite, as I've just defined them, to come to power. If that's what you're asking, I think kind of histories of neoliberalism do that job very well. I'm more concerned about the justifications they use themselves, typically around merit, and the convergence of attacks on the liberal elite by left and right in a way that has, I think, undermined a left project by ending up in a very reactionary space. But you can come back if I haven't answered your question, I think.
We will leave it there, Marie. Joseph, if you want to come back to Marie, just please go ahead and raise your hand once again, and I will call on you then. The floor is open now for other questions from our audience. Pete, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
So thanks for a fantastic talk. So I'm just interested in how you're thinking about a couple of things definitionally, because you define anti-elitism, but not necessarily what you conceive of as an elite. And I was thinking about how sometimes a key element of a definition is in the boundaries it implicitly draws. So I'm interested in who you think is an elite and where are the cutoffs for where someone is part of an elite or not. How might this differ for different types of elite? Political, economic, military, ideological, cultural, scientific, and so on. And you critiqued engaged constructions of the elite as, I would say, sort of like as a floating signifier, but didn't necessarily engage with contemporary social scientific definitions. So, for example, I think the most recent scholarship is more or less converged around Seamus Cahn's definition of it as those who have vastly disproportionate control over access to a resource where that resource has a transferable value. So, like crudely put, economic elite spend money, generals command military power, and so on. And it seems like you've engaged the question of the elite from the perspective of the meaning construction of the elite, but less with the real power that they necessarily wield and control. And I'm just wondering if by anchoring the definition in privilege, which I think is really interesting, but does that obscure, for example, certain types of military power? Are people within the military considered part of an elite? Because that form of power is often hidden and not necessarily connected to privilege. So I'm just really interested in how you're thinking through all these things. These were the thoughts that came to my head as you're talking. Thanks again for your...
No, thanks very much, Pete. Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And as I said a few times, any of the questions I can't answer are dealt with in a later part of the book. But you're right. I am mainly focused on the ideological work the concept of an elite is doing in the political imaginaries of the right, left, and mainstream. And so that's definitely my starting point. So rather than try and pin down what I mean by an elite, I take issue with the idea that there's this assumption that elites just exist out there, because I think that's at the heart of the confusion between left and right varieties of anti-elitism, or at least it enables it. So I'm trying to push people to think about what is the ideological work? What happens when you say that person is an elite? Like, what happens when somebody calls me an elite? What are they talking about? And generally what they're talking about is that I occupy a position of privilege or power that I don't deserve, that I have come to somehow illegitimately, or that I'm just using that power in an illegitimate way. So I think most groups that are referred to as elites, that kind of understanding is mobilized, but then it's put to work in different imaginaries to different ends. But to answer your question, so, politically, ideologically, if I was going to use the idea of an elite to refer to a group, a disproportionately privileged and powerful group, I would be an emancipatory anti-elitist. I would deploy the term within a worldview that seeks to eradicate privilege rather than restore it to deserving groups in one way or another. But what I think we need to do is precisely, as you say, to rethink the very concept of an elite so it can do the work of emancipatory anti-elitism properly. And that's what I do in the final stages of the book. And what I do is I deploy a critical realist account of elites as powerful actors within different social systems who are placed so that they can activate the causal mechanisms of those systems. Quite a technical way of thinking about it, but I'll hopefully explain it more accessibly. So elites aren't people who are head of different institutions as C. Wright Mills had it. They're not at the center of a network or a clique as Bourdieu had it, but they are placed within social structures in such a way that they're able to activate its causal mechanisms to make that system work, and are able to extract power and privilege as a result. So financial elites are, they're positioned so as they have kind of control over flows of money, over flows of finance. They kind of make the financial system go. I'm an elite in this understanding in the sense that I have some sort of power to shape public discourse or to award degrees. I'm able to kind of activate the mechanisms of a cultural or educational system. So that's one way of thinking about elites. And then I try and align them, different kinds of elites, with social classes by thinking about them not as part of a social class, but as actors that we can see insofar as they activate social mechanisms of particular social structures, ultimately serve to reproduce social class mechanisms too. So, for example, a trade union elite, I think we can refer to trade union elites, but the structures and the mechanisms they activate maintain the working class as a group, and you can kind of make the same analysis all the way up. It's quite hard to explain without sort of slides and a mechanism for going through, but that's the basic outline of how I then define an elite that I think it can be usefully deployed within emancipatory anti-elitism and not so usefully used within reactionary or liberal varieties.
Spain, studying at DCU peer support working in mental health. I'm beginning to get interested in social theory and reading some of your published articles, and I'd like to learn more about social theory. Could you suggest a book for me to start with? You've introduced me to Jim McGugan and Raymond Williams. However, that's far beyond Alan's level. Just a beginner in social theory. What's a good text that you would recommend? Great question, Alan.
Yeah, there's a book called Being Sociological that I think is very useful because it takes concepts and ideas and shows you how to use them, how to be sociological, how to think like a social theorist. And it's I forget the authors, but if you look it up, it's called Being Sociological, and it draws on like all the work that I've discussed, Raymond Williams and Jim McGuigan and all these different social theorists, but it just makes it very relevant and accessible. So that might be one for you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Anyone else? I know for myself, I'm going to have to sit with Marie's comments and think about them for a good number of days before I come back with even a cogent question, as I do with most social theory. Joseph Lynch has come back, Marie. So I'm going to call on Joseph. Thank you, Joseph, one more time. So, Joseph?
Yeah, hello?
Excellent. Yes, we can hear you.
Marie, it's just something you said about systems, and you mentioned Bordeaux. This notion of eliteness, is it just a function of the system to actually create these different groups or categories? I'm curious about that. Your identity is drawn from these systems. But does the individual person actually, can they draw their identity or confirm their individual identity as an elite? It's a broader question, and it's I'm just curious.
I'm not sure if I
mean, per class. So
yeah.
I identify myself as a member of the working class, but this Joseph Lynch, yes, apart from. So in this term, elite, can you actually draw a definition that is extracted from the system itself, and also confirm your own identity as an elite, apart from the system? And in an existential sense. And the two interconnected, the system's identity and the individual identity.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question to your liking, Joseph, but I do think in terms of how the concept now works, I think very few people are likely to admit that they're an elite or refer to themselves as a member of the elite, because I think the concept has changed. So now that it specifies you don't deserve the privileges you have, you're too powerful. What did you do to deserve this? You're an illegitimately powerful or privileged person, and that's why nobody's an elite. Everybody's anti-elitist. Even Donald Trump is an anti-elitist. You know, all these right-wing politicians are amazingly anti-elitist. You know, how can that be? That's what, you know, that's at the heart of what I'm trying to get at. And I think it's precisely because of how it works at that ideological level. Very, very powerfully, it mobilizes a lot of powerful moral ideas about desert and what is justified for people, what people are entitled to and what they're not. And I think that is its powerful mobilizing force. So I don't think anybody is really going to say, you know, I'm a member of the elite. And yet, because those older laudatory senses of elite as cream of the crop or the deservedly privileged, they still exist. We still see them in references to crack military teams or elite athletes. Some people, like Donald Trump, can't help but think, well, actually, I am the elite, but I'm just not allowed to say that because that means I don't deserve all this stuff I've got. So there's all these pretty entertaining ones from Trump who in the same sentence says something like, oh, those liberal elites. And then he says, wait a second, I've got a bigger house. I've got the boats. I'm the elite. They're the stone cold losers. I think that's one of his actual quotes. So it's doing this very intricate ideological work, I think. So yeah, it answers your question. I don't think it's going to work in that way where people will identify with a sense of pride as an elite. But they certainly will refer to other people as elites.